The first thing my mom did when she saw me was put her hand on my shoulder and shove me backward. Not gently, not discreetly. She pushed me hard enough that my heel slid on the marble floor, hard enough that the people closest to us stopped talking mid-sentence. Her voice didn't rise, but it carried. Calm, precise, final. The poor don't belong here. She said it like a rule everyone already knew, like she was correcting a mistake. Around us, the room froze. Crystal glasses hovered in the air. A man in a tailored suit cleared his throat and looked away. Someone laughed too late, too loudly, then stopped. No one stepped in. No one asked if I was okay. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a performance, and they were all the audience. I looked past my mother's shoulder and saw my sister standing just behind her. Perfect posture, perfect dress. And there it was. A small, controlled smile pulling at the corner of her mouth. Not shock, not embarrassment, satisfaction. That was when it hit me. This wasn't about what I was wearing or how I looked or whether I fit the room. This was intentional. This was erasure. I realized, standing there in front of powerful guests and people who controlled money and futures, that my mother wasn't pushing me out of a party. She was pushing me out of the family. I stepped back, not because she told me to, but because staying would have meant begging. And I wasn't going to do that. The noise slowly returned as I moved away. Conversations restarted in softer tones. Laughter reappeared, thinner than before. I walked past servers holding trays of champagne, past floor-to-ceiling windows that reflected a version of myself I barely recognized. Someone brushed my arm and murmured, "Sorry," without looking at me. By the time I reached the edge of the room, my hands were shaking, not from fear, from clarity. This wasn't about money. It never was. It was about sending a message, about showing everyone exactly where I stood and where I didn't. The event itself had been months in the making, a celebration for my mother's company, marking the signing of a massive financial contract that had secured her position at the top of the industry. Investors, executives, political connections, all gathered under soft lighting and curated music. This was her victory lap, her proof that she was untouchable. Family was part of the image she sold: stability, legacy, control. And tonight, I didn't belong in that picture. My mother stood at the center of the room, composed and radiant, greeting guests like a queen receiving tribute. She was a CEO long before she was a parent, and everyone there knew it. They respected her, they feared her, they trusted her with their money. That was what mattered. My presence disrupted the symmetry. My sister, on the other hand, fit perfectly. She moved through the room with ease, laughing at the right moments, touching arms lightly, saying just enough and never too much. She had learned early how to perform belonging. Standing beside our mother, she looked like a natural extension of her power. I had spent years being told I was different, too quiet, too withdrawn, not polished enough. Tonight, that difference had finally been declared out loud. I left without saying goodbye. Outside, the night air felt colder than it should have. I walked until the music faded completely, until the glow from the windows disappeared behind me. By the time I reached my apartment, the silence felt heavier than the crowd ever had. I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at my phone. No messages, no missed calls, no follow-up explanations. They had already moved on. The contrast was almost absurd. Inside that room, champagne flowed and deals were toasted. In my apartment, the lights flickered faintly and the radiator clicked on and off. Two worlds separated by a single sentence. The poor don't belong here. That night didn't hurt because it was cruel. It hurt because it was honest. I understood then that what happened wasn't a sudden rejection. It was the final step in something that had been happening for years. I hadn't lost my place. I had never truly had one. And if that was the case, then the only thing left to do was figure out who I was without them. I didn't know it yet, but that moment, the shove, the words, the smile behind her, was the line. Everything before it had been preparation. Everything after would be something else entirely. That night didn't break me. It clarified everything. As I lay awake in my apartment, staring at the ceiling while the city hummed outside, I understood something with painful certainty. What happened at the party wasn't an emotional outburst or a moment of stress. It was the logical conclusion of a system I had grown up inside. In my family, love was never unconditional. It was earned, measured, and withdrawn the moment it stopped being useful. Growing up, our dinner table never felt like a place to rest. It felt like a boardroom with better lighting. Conversations revolved around numbers, deals, reputations, and appearances. My mother spoke in the same tone she used with clients: calm, strategic, always 3 steps ahead. Compliments were rare and specific. They came only when someone achieved something that could be displayed, leveraged, or monetized. Affection didn't disappear. It just came with terms. My mother believed deeply in one principle: success was survival. In her world, being respected meant being untouchable, and being untouchable meant controlling money. Emotions were tolerated only if they didn't interfere with outcomes. Weakness was not punished outright. It was quietly removed. I learned that lesson early. When I brought home accomplishments that didn't translate into prestige or profit, they were acknowledged politely and forgotten quickly. When I struggled, the response wasn't anger or concern. It was distance, silence, a subtle suggestion that I should be doing better by now. My sister, on the other hand, thrived in that environment. She understood instinctively what was rewarded. She learned how to dress, how to speak, how to make people feel important. She didn't challenge my mother's authority. She mirrored it. Praise followed her like a shadow, not because she asked for it, but because she knew how to attract it. I watched her become the center of everything without ever seeming to try. She wasn't cruel to me, not in obvious ways. She didn't need to be. Her superiority lived in small moments. A glance when I spoke too long. A smile when someone mistook me for an assistant. A casual comment about how not everyone is built for pressure. She never pushed me down. She simply stepped over me again and again and learned that no one would stop her. My difference became impossible to ignore as I got older. I didn't enjoy the performative side of power. I didn't like networking dinners or empty conversations wrapped in flattery. I listened more than I spoke. I asked questions instead of making statements. In a family that valued dominance, curiosity looked like hesitation. I began to disappear long before the night my mother shoved me. I was left out of meetings, then out of plans, then out of conversations altogether. At social events, I was introduced vaguely, if at all. "This is my daughter," my mother would say, without adding more. The implication was clear. Whatever I was doing didn't matter enough to explain. For a long time, I thought the problem was me. I tried to adjust. I tried to speak up more, to seem more confident, to fit into the mold that had clearly been prepared for someone else. Every attempt felt like wearing clothes that didn't belong to me. The harder I tried, the more invisible I became. Eventually, something inside me shifted. Not anger, not rebellion, acceptance. I stopped trying to earn space in a room that had no intention of giving it to me. I stopped waiting for validation that was never coming. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't announce my withdrawal. I simply stepped back and watched. That was the pattern in my family. If you didn't serve the image, you were slowly removed from it. No dramatic confrontations, no raised voices, just a quiet recalibration, until one day you realized you no longer existed in the narrative at all. The party was the first time that process became public. My mother didn't hesitate when she pushed me. That told me everything. She wasn't embarrassed. She wasn't conflicted. She believed she was doing the right thing, not just for herself, but for the family as a whole. I was a disruption, and disruptions were eliminated. Sitting alone in my apartment, I replayed the scene over and over, not to torture myself, but to understand it. The words, the timing, the audience. It had been calculated. That was when I stopped wondering how I could fix things. There was nothing to fix. I wasn't failing my family. I was incompatible with their definition of value. And for the first time, I allowed myself to consider the possibility that this wasn't a flaw. If worth in my family was measured by visibility, money, and power, then maybe I needed to build a life that used a different scale entirely. I didn't know yet what that life would look like. I only knew that staying meant shrinking until there was nothing left of me. And leaving, quietly and without permission, was the only way to survive. I didn't announce my exit. I didn't pack a dramatic suitcase or deliver a final speech. One day I simply stopped showing up, and no one noticed quickly enough to stop me. There were no slammed doors, no tearful confrontations. I let invitations go unanswered. I stopped attending dinners where I sat quietly while decisions were made without me. I moved out of the orbit of my family the same way you move out of a shadow, slowly, until the light changes and you realize you are standing somewhere else entirely. At first, the absence felt unreal. I had grown so used to being overlooked that choosing to leave felt like a mistake I would be punished for. I waited for the call telling me I was being unreasonable, dramatic, ungrateful. It never came. That silence confirmed what I already knew. My presence had never been essential. I found a small apartment on the edge of the city. It wasn't impressive. The walls were thin, the windows faced an alley, and the furniture was whatever I could afford secondhand. But it was mine. No strings, no expectations. No one tracking my movements or weighing my usefulness. Living there was terrifying and freeing at the same time. For the first time, every decision belonged to me. What I ate, when I slept, how I spent my time. There was no safety net waiting if I failed, but there was also no pressure to perform a role I didn't believe in. I wasn't pushed out financially. I walked away from comfort deliberately, even though I didn't fully understand what I was walking toward yet. I took work wherever I could find it, roles that didn't come with prestige or connections. Through one of those jobs, I was introduced to the electric vehicle industry. Not the glossy marketing side, but the part no one liked to talk about. The engineering bottlenecks, the inefficiencies. The limitations everyone accepted because no one had figured out how to solve them yet. It wasn't glamorous. It was quiet. People cared more about results than appearances. For the first time in my life, I felt like my way of thinking wasn't a liability. I listened, I observed, I learned. The idea didn't arrive fully formed. It started as a question I couldn't let go of. Why did energy storage have to be static? Why couldn't a battery adapt in real time, respond to usage patterns, predict stress before failure? I began sketching concepts late at night, after work, when the city outside my window settled into a low hum. Those nights turned into months. I worked alone, not because I didn't trust others, but because I trusted myself more. I tested small models, adjusted parameters, failed repeatedly. Progress came in inches, not leaps. I learned patience the hard way. Every breakthrough was followed by 3 setbacks. Still, I kept going. I told no one. I didn't post updates or share milestones. I didn't mention it to former colleagues or distant relatives who occasionally checked in out of curiosity, and I never told my family. I understood them too well to make that mistake. Anything valuable would be taken, reshaped, and presented as theirs. Credit would disappear. Control would follow. This wasn't revenge. Not yet, it was protection. I separated everything, different devices, secure backups, no overlap between my personal life and my work. I documented timelines meticulously, not because I was paranoid, but because I had learned what happened when people in power felt entitled to what you built. Slowly, the work began to show signs of life. Data behaved differently than expected. Efficiency curves flattened where they shouldn't have. The system adjusted itself under stress in ways existing models couldn't. I didn't celebrate, I verified. I reran tests. I assumed I was wrong until the numbers refused to be ignored. A few people noticed, quietly. A question here. A request to see more details there. I kept everything surface level, careful not to reveal too much. Interest didn't scare me. Exposure did. All the while, my family continued their lives without me. I saw it occasionally, through photos or secondhand mentions. Events, vacations, smiling faces. I wasn't missed. And for the first time, that realization didn't hurt the way it used to. They believed I was insignificant. They believed I had faded into something small and forgettable. In their world, if you weren't visible, you weren't powerful. If you weren't powerful, you didn't matter. I let them believe it. While they measured worth in money and status, I was learning how to create value from nothing but time, discipline, and silence. I was building something that didn't need their approval to exist. I didn't know when it would matter. I only knew that one day, the world they trusted so completely would shift. Markets always do. And when that happened, the things built quietly tend to last the longest. I was no longer trying to belong. I was preparing to stand on my own, whether anyone was watching or not. The morning everything shifted started like any other. I was halfway through making coffee when my phone began vibrating nonstop on the counter. Alerts stacked on top of each other, red numbers flashing, headlines written in language I hadn't seen in years, markets plunging, liquidity evaporating, analysts using words they usually avoided because they scared people. This wasn't a routine correction. It wasn't panic driven by rumor. It was structural, sudden, and violent. A black swan. I sat down and scrolled, reading faster than the coffee could cool. Entire sectors were bleeding. Funds were freezing withdrawals. Margin calls were triggering across portfolios that had been considered stable just days before. The world my family trusted, the one built on leverage and confidence, was cracking in real time. By midday, I saw my mother's company name appear in a headline. At first, it was subtle. A mention in an article about exposure, a quote from an unnamed source questioning risk management. Then the tone shifted. Analysts started connecting dots, overextended positions, aggressive strategies that worked until they didn't. The same boldness that had built her reputation was now being reframed as recklessness. The stock price fell in steps, not all at once. Each drop was followed by a brief pause, a false hope, then another slide. I watched it happen without emotion. Not because I didn't care, but because I understood what I was seeing. Confidence is a currency. Once it collapses, everything priced in it follows. Inside the firm, I imagined the atmosphere changing by the hour. Phones ringing without pause, advisors scrambling, meetings turning sharp, then desperate. My mother thrived on control, but markets don't negotiate. They expose. What surprised me wasn't the speed of the collapse. It was the silence that came with it. For days, my phone stayed quiet. No calls, no messages. No sudden attempts at reconciliation. I wasn't included in emergency meetings or whispered about in leaks. It was as if I didn't exist at all. The same erasure I had grown used to, now happening under far more dangerous circumstances. I watched from the outside, not with satisfaction, but with clarity. Power built on image is fragile. Once the image cracks, the people who relied on it start looking for exits. Articles multiplied, commentators questioned leadership, regulators hinted at inquiries, clients began pulling assets quietly at first, then openly. Relationships that had taken decades to build unraveled in days. Legacy doesn't protect you when numbers stop making sense. That was when the call came. I recognized my mother's number immediately. It rang longer than I expected before I answered, not because I wanted to make a point, but because I needed a moment to steady myself. When I finally picked up, her voice was calm, too calm. "We're facing unprecedented conditions," she said, as if reading from a prepared statement. "The firm needs support to stabilize key positions." There was no mention of the party, no acknowledgement of what she had done, no apology. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't ask where I'd been. She spoke to me the way she spoke to executives she was negotiating with. Direct, controlled, focused on outcomes. I listened without interrupting. She outlined the situation in broad strokes: capital shortfalls, partners getting nervous, the need for strategic intervention to reassure the right people. It was a pitch, not a plea. She wasn't asking as a mother. She was making a case as a CEO who had run out of options. When she finally paused, waiting for my response, I felt something settle inside me. I was valuable again, not as a daughter, as a resource. The scale of the disaster became clearer with every word. This wasn't about weathering a bad quarter. Bankruptcy was no longer theoretical. Years of careful positioning were at risk of collapsing under the weight of a market that no longer believed the story it had been told. I thought about everything she had built, everything she had prioritized, everything she had been willing to sacrifice to stay in control. And I thought about what letting it all burn would mean. I owed them nothing. That much was clear. But walking away completely would have changed me in ways I wasn't sure I wanted. Not because they deserved saving, but because I needed to know I could choose who I was, independent of their failures. I told her I would consider it. We met in person 2 days later, not at her home, not anywhere familiar. A neutral office, glass walls, no family photos. The setting matched the nature of the conversation. This wasn't reconciliation. It was negotiation. As she spoke, I watched her carefully. The confidence was still there, but it was strained now, held together by discipline rather than certainty. She needed me, and she hated that. I agreed to help, but only on my terms. I wouldn't return to the family. I wouldn't be visible. My name wouldn't be used. My involvement would remain quiet, clean, and temporary. She hesitated, then nodded. Desperation makes people flexible. As I left the building, I felt no triumph, only awareness. Crises don't create character, they reveal it. And I had just stepped back into the orbit of people who had already shown me exactly who they were. I knew then that saving them would come at a cost. I just didn't know yet how high they planned to make me pay. The meeting took place in a glass-walled conference room that smelled faintly of disinfectant and stress. No one hugged me. No one asked how I'd been. My mother nodded once, the way she did when acknowledging a senior executive who had arrived on time. Papers were already laid out on the table, aligned with obsessive precision. She didn't waste a second pretending this was personal. "We need to move quickly," she said. "Stability is everything right now." I sat across from her and listened. She spoke in bullet points: liquidity gaps, counterparty confidence, temporary restructuring. Not once did she reference the night she shoved me out of her celebration or the words she'd used to justify it. That silence wasn't accidental. It was strategy. What she wanted from me was clear: access to capital, strategic thinking, quiet introductions to people who still trusted me, even if they didn't know why. What she didn't offer was just as clear: no apology, no acknowledgement, no restoration of my place in the family. This wasn't a return. It was a transaction. She didn't need me visible. She needed me effective. I would work behind the scenes, unseen and unnamed, while she reassured investors and rebuilt confidence. The unspoken condition hung in the air. I could help as long as I remained invisible. I agreed, but not without drawing lines. I told her my name would not be used. I would not attend events or appear in meetings. No one would have access to my personal assets, my independent work, or anything I had built outside the firm. My involvement would be temporary and contained. I spoke calmly, without emotion, the way she had taught me to speak my entire life. For the first time, she hesitated. It lasted less than a second, but I saw it. Then she nodded. Desperation has a way of softening even the most rigid egos. She accepted my terms because she had no leverage left. The work began immediately. I moved money where it needed to go, quietly and efficiently. I helped unwind positions that never should have existed. I reached out to people who trusted my judgment, not my family name, and reassured them just enough to slow the bleeding. I didn't save the firm in a dramatic sweep. I stabilized it inch by inch, stopping the panic before it turned fatal. Within weeks, the headlines softened. The stock stopped free-falling. Partners who had frozen communication reopened channels. The crisis didn't disappear, but it stopped escalating. From the outside, it looked like my mother had navigated the storm through sheer force of will. No one thanked me. There were no late-night calls of gratitude, no quiet acknowledgments. The relief in the room was palpable, but it wasn't directed at me. I wasn't the savior. I was the mechanism. Once the immediate danger passed, my sister reappeared. She hadn't been present during the worst of it. When everything was on fire, she was conspicuously absent. But the moment stability returned, so did she. Confident, polished, performing loyalty with renewed enthusiasm. She smiled at me in the hallways, asked how I was doing, commented on how impressive it was that things had turned around. On the surface, it sounded supportive. Underneath, her questions carried weight. How long would I be involved? What authority I had? What agreements were in place? Whether my support came with expectations? I answered carefully, briefly. I didn't offer more than necessary. The shift was subtle, but I felt it. Conversations started happening without me. Advisors stopped looping me in. Documents appeared on my desk for review that had already been finalized. When decisions were announced, they were framed as collective outcomes with no reference to my role. I wasn't being pushed out yet. I was being evaluated. One afternoon, I noticed a clause in a routine document that hadn't been there before. Temporary authority, it said. Emergency powers granted to ensure operational continuity. The language was vague enough to sound harmless, specific enough to raise alarms. I asked about it. I was told not to worry. That was when the familiar unease returned. The same quiet tightening in my chest I'd felt years earlier, back when I was still trying to belong. This was how it started, not with open hostility, but with paperwork, with decisions justified as necessary, with control shifting hands while everyone pretended it wasn't happening. I realized then that saving them hadn't changed the rules. It had only reset the board. My usefulness was expiring. And in my family, when usefulness ended, elimination followed. The final confirmation came in the smallest way. A meeting scheduled without me. An email chain I wasn't copied on. A legal advisor referring to my involvement in the past tense. I had restored their power, and now they were preparing to reclaim it. That night, I sat alone in my apartment and replayed the past weeks in my head. The deal, the silence, the return of confidence in their voices. Gratitude had never been part of the equation. It never would be. I understood, with a clarity that left no room for denial, that I hadn't just stepped back into their orbit. I had stepped into a trap, and whatever they were planning next wouldn't be financial. It would be legal. The shift didn't announce itself. It arrived quietly, disguised as efficiency. Emails became shorter. Meetings moved without notice. Decisions that once came to me for review were finalized before I saw them. When I spoke, people nodded, then continued as if I hadn't. I recognized the pattern immediately. I had gone from solution to obstacle. My sister was suddenly everywhere. She started sitting in on calls she'd never attended before, asking questions that sounded curious but landed like probes. How were assets structured? Who technically held authority during emergencies? What documentation existed around my involvement? She smiled as she spoke, friendly and deferential, the perfect proxy for my mother's will. I answered carefully. I always had. But I could feel the ground shifting beneath my feet. Documents began appearing in my inbox with unfamiliar language buried deep in the text. Amendments framed as temporary measures. Clauses labeled risk containment. Authority reassigned in the name of stability. Everything sounded reasonable if you didn't look too closely. Everything made my skin crawl when I did. When I asked for clarification, I was told I was overthinking, that the firm needed flexibility, that this was standard procedure. My mother didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. She simply dismissed my concerns with the calm certainty she reserved for people she no longer needed to persuade. Then the isolation began. Calls stopped coming. Meetings were canceled last minute. My access to internal systems was delayed, then restricted. When I walked into the office, conversation stalled. Eyes flicked away. I had seen this before. This was how my family erased problems. They didn't confront. They surrounded. The first accusation arrived disguised as concern. A compliance officer asked me to clarify a transaction I had never authorized. A legal advisor requested documentation I wasn't permitted to access anymore. Questions multiplied, each one framed as routine, each one building a narrative I didn't recognize. I asked my mother what was happening. She told me it was precautionary, that regulators were watching closely, that distancing the firm from outside influence was necessary for credibility. She didn't look at me when she said it. I understood then that they weren't trying to protect the company. They were protecting it from me. The trap closed on a Tuesday morning. 2 men I didn't recognize were waiting when I arrived. They introduced themselves politely. Investigators. There had been allegations of financial misconduct, misrepresentation, abuse of authority. They spoke in neutral tones, careful not to imply guilt while implying everything. My access was revoked on the spot, accounts frozen, devices collected. I was escorted out of the building I had just saved. My mother stood in the hallway, hands clasped, face unreadable. My sister stood beside her, perfectly still. Neither of them said a word. By that afternoon, the narrative was already moving without me, protecting the firm, ensuring transparency, isolating risk. Every phrase I heard echoed the language I had seen creeping into documents weeks earlier. This wasn't a reaction, it was execution. The detention came quickly. Temporary, they said, pending investigation, standard procedure. The room they placed me in was small and bare, designed to make time stretch and identity dissolve. Questions repeated in cycles, dates, signatures, decisions taken out of context and rearranged until they sounded criminal. I answered everything truthfully. It didn't matter. Days passed, then weeks. No one called, no lawyer from the firm, no message from my mother, no inquiry from my sister. The silence wasn't fear, it was confirmation. They had already written me off. Publicly and privately, I was the problem they had solved. At night, when the noise died down and the lights dimmed, the weight of it settled fully. Not the injustice, the precision. They hadn't acted in anger. They hadn't panicked. They had waited until I was most vulnerable, then moved all at once. Blood had become a weapon. I replayed every conversation, every document, every moment of hesitation I'd ignored. I had known this was possible. I had sensed it coming. But knowing something and preparing for it are different things. I had underestimated how far they were willing to go. Still, beneath the fear, something else took shape. Clarity. They believed I was isolated, that I had no leverage left, that without access, without visibility, without power, I would fold. They didn't understand that I had survived invisibility my entire life. I wasn't screaming, I wasn't pleading, I was waiting. Somewhere outside those walls, the truth still existed. Timelines, records, intentions they thought were invisible. I didn't know yet who would bring it forward or how long it would take. I only knew one thing. Silence was their weapon. And soon, it would stop working. Time lost its shape inside that place. Days blended together until I stopped counting them. The lights never fully dimmed, never fully brightened. Meals arrived at regular intervals, reminders that the world outside still ran on schedules I no longer belonged to. I wasn't afraid the way I thought I would be. Fear requires uncertainty. What I felt instead was a dull, steady clarity. No one from my family called. Not my mother, not my sister, not a lawyer pretending to act on my behalf. Their silence was deliberate, calculated to look like caution. Pending investigation, standard procedure. The same language they had used to erase me from meetings and documents now erased me from concern altogether. I understood the message. I was expendable. Interrogations came and went, and the questions repeated, reshaped slightly each time, as if saying them differently might change the truth. They asked about decisions made under pressure, approvals issued during the crisis, transactions framed without context. I answered calmly. I didn't argue. I had learned long ago that panic only feeds the story others want to tell about you. What I didn't know, sitting in that room with its blank walls and muted sounds, was that someone outside had refused to stay quiet. Her name never appeared in official paperwork. She wasn't family. She wasn't powerful. She was simply the one person who had stayed close to me when everything else fell away. My friend had seen pieces of what I'd been dealing with long before the collapse. Not details, not names. Just enough to recognize the shape of something wrong. After I was detained, they found her. It started with polite inquiries, then concern, then offers, substantial ones, money, protection. Promises that this would all go away if she helped clarify a few things. If she handed over what she knew, if she cooperated. She said no. She didn't announce it. She didn't warn me. She didn't need to. Instead, she did what I had always done. She documented. She gathered. She stayed quiet while they assumed silence meant compliance. The USB was small, unremarkable, easy to overlook. Inside it was a timeline they hadn't bothered to check. Communications saved because someone forgot to delete them. Versions of documents that proved when language changed and who ordered it. Messages that showed coordination, intent, and the moment the story shifted from rescue to removal. Nothing dramatic, nothing theatrical. Just truth, arranged carefully enough to speak for itself. I didn't know any of this while I sat waiting. What I did notice was the change. The questions shifted tone. The pauses grew longer. One of the investigators started taking notes when I spoke instead of interrupting. Another asked me to repeat a date, then nodded as if confirming something he already suspected. I wasn't told why. I was escorted back to my room and left there longer than usual. Hours passed without interruption. When they finally returned, their language had softened. Not apologetic, procedural, controlled. The investigation would be expanded. Certain allegations required further review. I was being released pending reassessment. Just like that. The door opened. My belongings were returned. The air outside felt sharper than I remembered. Freedom didn't rush in all at once. It settled slowly, like a weight lifting from my chest, without fanfare. My phone was handed back to me. It was silent. No missed calls, no frantic messages, no apologies racing to fill the gap. My family had already chosen their position, and they weren't moving from it. I met my friend that evening in a quiet place where no one paid attention. She didn't dramatize what she'd done. She didn't wait for thanks. She simply slid the USB across the table and said she was glad I was out. That was when I understood the full scope of what had happened. They hadn't expected resistance. They hadn't planned for loyalty that couldn't be bought. They had assumed I was alone because they had always treated me that way. It never occurred to them that someone else might see me clearly. The truth was moving now, through offices and inboxes and systems designed to pretend neutrality. I didn't need to push it. I didn't need to explain myself. Once truth enters those channels, it does its work quietly and thoroughly. I didn't confront my mother. I didn't call my sister. I didn't demand answers. There was nothing left to say. Family, I realized, had never been the people who shared my blood. It was the people who refused to let me disappear when silence became convenient. As I walked away, I felt no urge to look back. Consequences were coming, and they would arrive without my involvement. For the first time since that night at the party, I felt something close to peace. I had survived the erasure. Now I was done explaining myself to anyone who had needed me gone. I didn't rush home after my release. I walked. The city felt different when no one was chasing me, when no one expected me to explain myself. Cars passed. People laughed into their phones. Life moved forward without pausing to acknowledge what I had just survived. I liked that. Freedom didn't announce itself. It simply let me breathe. The consequences for my family unfolded without my involvement. Investigations widened. Audits were triggered quietly, the kind that didn't make headlines but changed everything behind closed doors. Advisors distanced themselves. Partners stopped returning calls. Confidence, once fractured, never fully recovered. The firm didn't collapse overnight. It bled slowly, reputation draining first, then influence, then trust. I didn't watch closely. I didn't need to. My sister's fall was faster. Without my mother's full protection, she was exposed. Meetings she once dominated went silent when she entered. Invitations dried up. The charm that had carried her so far suddenly had nothing to lean on. People who had smiled at her for years began treating her like a liability instead of an asset. I felt no satisfaction, only confirmation. I rebuilt my life with intention, new routines, clear boundaries, no unnecessary explanations. I chose collaborators carefully and trusted slowly. The work I had protected for so long no longer needed to hide, but I didn't rush it into the spotlight either. Quiet growth had served me well. I wasn't interested in trading one kind of noise for another. The final severing happened without drama. I blocked numbers. I archived emails without opening them. A letter arrived once, handwritten, careful, full of words that avoided responsibility. I didn't read past the first line. Closure doesn't require participation from the people who caused the harm. Cutting them off wasn't punishment. It was protection. For years I had been called poor because I didn't display power the way they understood it. I didn't dominate rooms. I didn't weaponize appearances. They confused volume with strength and control with worth. What they never understood was that real power doesn't need permission to exist. Quiet power survives the betrayal. I didn't win by destroying them. I won by refusing to disappear when they decided I should, by building something they couldn't claim, by walking away when staying would have meant losing myself. If you've ever been erased by the people who were supposed to protect you, I want you to know this. You don't owe anyone access to your future just because they were part of your past. Silence can be a boundary. Distance can be an answer. And choosing yourself is not selfish, no matter who tries to convince you otherwise. If this story resonated with you, share your experience in the comments. When did you realize you had to stop shrinking to survive your family? I read every story, and you're not alone here. And if you want to stay with this channel for more stories about quiet strength, hard boundaries, and justice that doesn't need applause, consider subscribing. Sometimes the most powerful victories are the ones we don't announce at all. This narrative is dramatized for storytelling impact. Thank you for listening.